Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores DORÉ ECCLES Foundation and the CLEONE Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Good evening and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, Director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Max Roth, anchor with Fox 13 News, Kate Bradshaw, Director of Government Affairs at Holland and Hart and Bountiful City Councilwoman, and Doug Wilks, editor of the Deseret News. Thank you all for being on the program tonight. We have such an interesting night worth of conversations to have about what's happening throughout the state. Perfect people to talk about it. I want to jump right into what's happening this very moment. We're filming the show on Thursday. At the very moment, our legislature is meeting for a special session, which is the first time that has happened this way. Max, take a second and talk about how unique this is, how our legislature has been able to call themselves together.
Yeah, it really is unprecedented, and this is just a new addition to Utah's Constitution and the legislative authority to be able to do this. So they've never called themselves into a special session before. It used to be the governor's prerogative. And then the other thing that, while that is the most significant legally, perhaps the thing that is the oddest, but something that we're all becoming so much more used to, is this will be the first virtual gathering of the state legislature, where all of these, you imagine how hectic one Zoom call can be with your family, and now think about 75 members of the State House of Representatives. It's really going to be something to behold, which we'll all be beholding virtually too.
Yeah. So Doug, let's talk about this newfound power for just a moment. It's interesting. Usually the governor gets to just call the legislature together. That's been historical, does a call and specifically talks about what they can go through. But this time, the call that came from the legislature said, in collaboration with the governor. Talk about what that means. Was there collaboration here? Is the legislature just setting their own stage?
Well, I think both legitimately know they need a special session. They need to accept funds from the federal government. They need to set the course for coming out of the worst of the coronavirus crisis, to reopen the state. And they said they want to do it in a methodical, smart way. So I do think both the executive and legislative branches want to play a role. Historically, the legislative branch always wants more of a role than the executive branch. And there's some bills in play today and through this session, for good or bad, suggest that they want more authority and power. Most interesting to me is there's no committee hearings through this. Mm-hmm. And we want the public's business to be done in public. So the Media Coalition actually had to go in and make sure that, hey, are the emails being sent to legislators part of the Grandma Open Meetings Act, and can the public have access? And so they've worked to try and make a session both functional but also available to the public. And this will be quite a grand experiment to see how this works today.
Doug, how do you plan on covering it? Because those are great points, and we're wondering about how we can watch, how we can engage. What is your, as the editor, how are you approaching it?
Well, we have reporters who are tuning in virtually. The public can go in and look. We're monitoring the emails. We don't have access to them until legislators post them. So we've encouraged legislators to post those emails from the public right away, which would give us immediate access to it. Otherwise, after the fact, we would go and assess what that is. We also have, from our opinion section, our writers are looking at how effective this session will be. But this clearly needs to happen because they need to deal with money and help the state get back on its feet.
Mm-hmm. Kate, let's address a couple of those issues because Max and Doug both brought up some great points about some things they're going to be talking about. But we've got to start with the money, because I think that's where they're going to start in the special session today. Talk about the problem they are trying to fix based on the budget. They just passed a $20 billion budget. They just passed last month in the legislative session. What are they trying to do?
Well, the session just ended, which means the state just balanced the budget, and they budget to projections. That's kind of how our system works. When they do that, that means that if those projections don't come in as expected, there'll be budget shortfalls, and we are anticipating at this point, with unemployment rising and a lot of people out of work and production down, that there'll be a drop in revenue. So one of the things they need to do is they need to go in and shift some money around. They've talked a lot about this. They'll move some cash that they had used to pay for buildings, in particular some university buildings, a new building on the Capitol complex, and they'll move that back in and shift it to where they think they're going to have some budget holes. There is also a bill to raise the state's bonding cap and authority, so that if needed, we can bond for funds we might need, or if we use all that cash up but things feel like they're better later in the year, we could bond to build those buildings. And then of course there's the CARES Act money that Congress put in place and has sent to the states to use in a myriad of ways to assist us with this crisis. Some of it they will pass through to cities and counties. Some they will use to pay for Medicaid, and a number of other things to help us deal with the pandemic and then deal with the economic recovery that'll come after.
Mm-hmm. Max, let's talk about how they're going to approach that, because right now there are so many programs, buildings, et cetera, that during the legislative session, the legislature funded. And this is over $800 million they're going to need to transfer from some of these organizations, from these projects, to help balance that budget to the end of the fiscal year. What's interesting about this, maybe just describe how they will approach it, because these are not necessarily full-time cuts. This is mostly a transfer. This legislative session will not be necessarily a permanent transfer of funds.
Well, not a permanent transfer, because there are immediate needs that they simply have to pay for with money that they have in the bank. It's just like with your family budget. You know, if you expect a tax return down the way, you can't spend that money until it's in your account. So you may use a credit card to pay for things that are necessities before that comes along. And that's essentially what they're doing in the short term. But there are two budget issues going on here. The one is that they are not going to be getting money in the short term that they expected to get because of putting off tax filing, those sorts of things. But then the other side of this is that the revenues are just going to be down tremendously because of retail spending being down. Much of the state budget relies on sales tax and on the kind of sales tax that is not going into the coffers right now, because, you know, groceries, we all talked about sales tax on food in the last legislative session. That's what people are buying. You know, they're going to the grocery store and buying food. And so when we see retail sales numbers so far down, the state is going to take a hit. And so that is an ongoing problem that they're going to have. They thought they were flush with money during the legislative session. They're not now.
Jason, if I can jump in, money is the key right now, right? Personally, for the state and nationally. Numbers came out again, 22 million unemployment claims filed in the past 4 weeks. That's phenomenal. The checks, the relief checks coming to people, a family of 4 gets $3,400. And I think 80 million people started getting those checks this week. So everyone's kind of concentrating on where's the money coming from? How do I pay my bills? And the state's doing the same thing. Where's the money coming from, and how do we pay the bills? And how do we help the business community survive and come out the other side?
Mm-hmm. And so much of this has to be federal, because the states have to balance their budget. They don't have a choice. So the state legislature, that's why they have to go into a special session and really deal with this, because they can't spend money they don't have, except, and Kate, you mentioned bonding, and they can do that in lieu of just spending money on one-time projects. They can borrow, but only within limits. It's only the federal government that can do what it's doing right now, which is to essentially just say, hey, we're going to spend $2 trillion. It doesn't necessarily exist, but we've got to inject some life into this economy.
Yep. Well, let's get to a couple of other items that our legislature is going to address. One is always the intrigue, Kate. Are we going to see any veto overrides?
There are a couple bills that they have put on the call, and they're saying that they're not necessarily veto overrides, but they're retooling the bills that were vetoed. There was one dealing with vouchers for special needs children. There was another dealing with fuel tax for railroads, things like that. And then an interesting resolution in support of the people in China. So those have all been retooled. So they're not, I don't think, straight up veto overrides, but in consultation with the governor, they've looked at some of those things. The governor did indicate that he was worried, particularly with the voucher, that we would be moving money outside of the public education system at a time where budgets might just be delicate. And that was an interesting kind of memo in his veto override note to the legislature. So they are going to take those up. They are listed on their call. There are bills that are available, but they're slightly different from a traditional veto override where you literally vote on the same bill again. This time they can make modifications that hopefully they've negotiated with the governor and have eased some of his concerns.
Okay, we'll see about that. Let's get to another item, because Doug, you brought this one up. They are proposing what they're calling the Pandemic Response and Consultation Act. This is the legislature giving some parameters to the governor about his executive powers. Maybe describe that one.
Well, this is that the legislature wants to force the governor to ask for permission on a crisis, basically, that any kind of executive order will require 48 hours notice to the legislature. You know, they can debate it, and, you know, again, we're taping before they take this up, but it's kind of counterintuitive to suggest that you would have a committee hold, you know, a meeting to decide how to respond to a crisis immediately when the crisis is happening. The governor has that power for a reason, just as health departments have power, you know, to advise lawmakers. You need to be able to respond quickly to a crisis. And so it'll be interesting to see if the legislature is trying to, if this is a power grab, if this is a good idea. But it's one of the most interesting things coming out, because that emergency power, whether it's an earthquake or a pandemic, there's a reason that the top executive has that authority to call an emergency.
Yeah, it seems like I was going to say, it seems like there are levels of crisis. You know, there's the immediacy of a crisis, you've got to call out the National Guard because of this flood, because of an earthquake, that sort of thing. But then then we're in the middle of an ongoing crisis where you know, you make a decision about keeping schools shut down. Maybe that is something where emergency powers can work along with some sort of notice requirement. So it's there are nuances to it. It makes sense that the governor has to be able to make a decision in the spur of the moment. Somebody has to when there is an emergency. But then this is an emergency that's months long.
Mm-hmm. How are people perceiving this one, though, Max? Is it what Doug was describing as maybe a little bit of power grab, or is this really just a balancing of the interests from the executive branch and the legislative branch?
You know, I think the perception, you say, how are people perceiving? And I know with public perception, at least, and I've only seen national polls to this extent, but people understand what's happening on the public health side of the coronavirus pandemic, and they're very concerned about that. They are more personally feeling hit and worried about the economic impacts of what's going on. So specifically, when someone is asked, okay, are you worried that you might get the virus? 39% of people say, yes, I'm worried about that. When you say, are you worried about how this economy is going to survive this? 59 people in some aggregations of poll numbers say that they are concerned about that. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that people don't see that it's necessary to take public health precautions, but we are seeing people start to push back in Utah. Specifically, we saw in St. George just this week a march of people protesting against stay-at-home orders, which actually there's not an order in place in Washington County. There's the governor's directive, which is more of a strong suggestion. But still, people are pushing back locally and nationally.
Mm-hmm. Kate, to that very good point, one of the items our legislature wants to consider in this special session is the issue that they see that there are differences of approaches in different local areas around the state, that counties or they may have their own approach to how to handle people staying home or not staying home. And you're an elected official. They're a little concerned about your ability to really take care of the people in your own district. Talk about that and how it's going to impact you.
Yeah, so we've learned, I mean, this has been, I think, an education for all of us. We have these 13 local health districts that the state is divided into, and they have a really impressive power that is wielded by non-elected people, by these health directors, to declare these public health emergencies and take certain actions. And the system was designed, quite frankly, to insulate them from the elected officials and from the push and pull of politics. There are many people who feel like where Utah's experiencing perhaps greater numbers along the Wasatch Front, but not so much in our rural areas, that this pandemic is not hitting us evenly. And of course, we are not, thank goodness, seeing what is happening in other states, in New York and in California and Louisiana. So this ability to react on a micro level is definitely getting attention and is the focus of one of these bills. Should these decisions be made by elected officials, by mayors, by city councils, in some cases city managers, or on a county level by the county commissioners, depending on their form of government. And it's an interesting discussion because there is definitely folks that feel like we swung the pendulum too far too fast in shutting down the economy. And there are others that think this is the only thing that is keeping our numbers so remarkably low. Personally, it's I think very difficult while we're still in the middle of the peak part to feel like we should switch chains of command and lines of authority in a session that we're doing quickly, that we're doing remotely, without as much ability to kind of weigh all of the pros and cons and think through that. So I'm very much hoping that as the legislature convenes and thinks about this, that they put on their most thoughtful hats and think through that.
Doug, I just want to take this up a couple of levels because it's interesting to talk about who's in charge. You might look at Kate as a member of the city council. She might think she has something to say about that. The governor certainly has indicated he has something to say about those stay-at-home directives. The legislature is about to weigh in, but even President Trump himself this week has said, oh no, he is the one that gets to make these kinds of decisions.
Well, the Bear River Health Department, which covers Box Elder, Cache, and Rich counties, they said that health clubs could begin this kind of soft reopening this week. So here's this very tiny communities in Utah, in America, and the health club now will have, you can use a machine if it's 10 feet apart, the gym is closed, and they're going to practice social distancing and see how it goes. And the community is they're talking about it. Some say this is the worst decision possible. Others say this is exactly what we need for our mental health. But that's on this really small level. Well, it does make sense that you look at the individual communities and see what's happening. Salt Lake City, where I live, it's a far different situation than what's going on in Price, Utah, where as of a week ago, they had 0 cases in their hospital down there. And the number of cases was minute. And people are wondering, well, why are we having to stay in our homes when we have less than half a dozen people who are impacted? So I do think you need this federalism, this local control, and the debate. I mean, the lawmakers can have the debate versus the governors and Trump. I think the Constitution's pretty clear. But it has been certainly an interesting civics lesson for all of us during this pandemic.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. Max, can I read you a quote as you give your comment?
Yes.
Because it was a tweet from President Trump himself to get to this idea of federalism that I thought was telling, and I'd just love to get your response to it. President Trump said, for the purpose of creating conflict and confusion, some in the fake news media are saying that it is the governor's decision to open up the states, not that of the President of the United States and the federal government. Let it be fully understood that this is incorrect. It is the decision of the President, and for many good reasons.
Well, it's what I find fascinating about this is that the president is saying that, and yet he's made very few decisions. The decisions that have been made by governors and by mayors and city councils. They haven't been. The president has he's made some decisions about travel. He has said that he's implementing the Defense Production Act, which allows him to have some coercion to get companies to produce things, but he hasn't actually put that into effect to any great degree. And so he's saying he's in charge, but effectively there's a difference between what you say and what you do. And I think most of us know that it's more significant in life to watch what people do, and the people who have been doing are governors and mayors and city councils. And the president has been talking, but he hasn't been making that many decisions.
Can we go ahead, Doug?
Weigh in on that quickly, since it deals with, in your words, the quote fake news media. Thank you, Jason, for that. I know
Not my words, of course.
The president 3 days ago talked about having absolute authority. The day after that, he said the decision will be up to the governors. And the day after that, he said, well, we're going to meet with all the governors, but then if we need to sort of have veto power over that, if we don't like what they're doing, then we'll take a different stance. So I agree with Max. There's been a lot of rhetoric, a lot of words, a lot of kind of gnashing of teeth on this point. But the action is the governors are doing what they need to do. The president believes he's doing what he needs to do, and the local officials are following their health departments. So it's really key to follow the actions and try to make the best decision possible, and not get agitated about what I just got agitated about, fake news, right? So
it's a great point. I thought that might get you for a moment.
Yeah, thank you.
A couple of things our legislature and some of our local governments are working. I just want to get to a couple. Some seem to be working okay, maybe not so great. Kate, so we had a couple of days of geo-tracker notifications. Everyone coming into the state gets a text message, and you get to say how you're feeling. That's gone already. What happened there?
Yeah, so this was an interesting experiment that we tried, and it got national attention. And I definitely had clients, multi-state clients, who were a little worried about this. How this would work is, as we were having, truckers moving back and forth across state lines to deliver food, deliver other types of products, people in border towns where their closest store or pharmacy might be just over the border in the state they don't live in. So the idea is that we would do this kind of light track and trace. Let's see if we can make sure that Utah is aware of whether we're having visitors come in and bring in the virus. So the text messages went out. We were all excited about trying out this geo-fencing. It turns out it works. It just works a little too good. And so you had some people, particularly those that live in border areas like in St. George or the Utah side of Wendover, up in northern Utah, that were getting these text messages 20 and 30 times a day. They might get them if they moved from their house to their backyard, asking them to please complete this survey. So it was decided that we would turn that off because it was working too well. It is sort of the same technology that exists when you get an Amber Alert or things like that. The request to still complete the information to use the app exists at the Salt Lake Airport, on billboards now, on our interstates as you enter. But the experiment of using the geofencing didn't work out exactly as we planned. So probably not going to see that again unless the emergency ramps to a new level.
Well, how about that?
I really felt, Jason, for the spokesperson for the Department of Public Safety, Joe Doherty, who was talking about, who had to go in front of the cameras to announce that they were going to discontinue this program. and he was saying things like, I understand that it was very annoying. And clearly, he said, and we have heard the hundreds of complaints that you have, because people were just getting barraged with these messages. But hey, they tried it. They recognized pretty quickly that it was a mistake, and they pulled back.
Yeah, not very often you hear someone saying the government program worked too well, to use Kate's words. One more thing I want to get to, Doug, for just a second too. On a very local level, the soft closure of schools in this state, the impact of this on families and caregivers just cannot be understated. Talk about that, because there's not exactly an end in mind. We just know no more school this year.
Well, there's the sort of personal cost everyone's kind of feeling for the seniors in high school who lost those months in that key crucial rite of passage year. The thing is, it's just very different for very many people. If you have a couple young kids and you're dealing with one first grader teacher, you can kind of manage it, but people have been scrambling for computer screens. I know of one family that between all their children and their age groups, they have 22 different teachers to deal with coming into the homes. Some want to do personal chats on computer, some want to give packets, some want to give lectures. And the management of that, while very often two people are also trying to hold down jobs remotely, that has been overwhelming for a lot of people. But I do think this is an aggressive action that had to be done, that schools are shut down nationwide, except for maybe one district in California I read about, and there were reasons for that. So I don't have a good answer for that. I just know it's impacting a lot of people. and we're learning a lot. I don't think education will be the same going back. I think they'll try and have efficiencies, and I think technology will become even more of a key player, and we'll learn a little more about ourselves through this process.
Yeah, you know
Jason,
what that, oh, go ahead, Kate.
I was just going to mention, my husband is a high school teacher, and it is amazing to me how many of the kids have checked in. A lot of them haven't. We're having a problem there. But so many of them are so ready to come back. It's honestly kind of awesome for teachers who sometimes maybe feel like their students maybe don't appreciate them, to see this response back saying, I miss you so much, and I miss going to school, and I miss learning. And so I think that, to a certain extent, has been very heartening for some of the teachers to hear from and see just the role they do play in their students' lives.
Max, last comment.
Yeah, just very quickly, one thing that this just makes me think about is that we don't know what's happening in all of the houses around us and in our communities, that there are people who are really struggling through different things, whether it's the mom with the kids, whether it's someone dealing with being out of work. There's real pain out there, and all of this is so meaningful, what we're talking about, and it's hard to wrap our heads around.
It is. We're feeling it on a very local level. Thank you so much for your great insights today, not just about the special session, but about these issues that are impacting every single one of us as Utahns. Thank you very much. And thank you for watching the Hinckley Report this evening. This show is also available as a podcast on pbsutah.org/Hinckley Report, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for being with us. We'll see you next week. Be safe.